Okay, so just recording some quick post-read thoughts. I just finished reading Danton, the Giant of the French Revolution by David, I think you pronounce it Lawday, David Lawday. So just some quick thoughts for my Goodreads account. I enjoyed this book at a high level. The main thing about it is, Danton, I think, is just like an extremely interesting and unlikely figure of the French Revolution. And I was a little surprised by the length. Like it's a relatively short book for biographies that are typically a lot longer on major historical figures. This book is about 300 pages. So on the one hand, I was a little surprised by that. On the other hand, that's also kind of why I was drawn to it. And I guess I wasn't really thinking like his professional political career ran from when he was about 29 till about 34 is when he was ultimately condemned and executed. So it actually kind of makes sense when you consider he is a huge figure, literally and figuratively, and he accomplished a ton in this crazy period of history, but he did die extremely young. So I think that kind of makes sense too. But I was drawn to this because I do like biographies that can be succinct and efficient, and this book is certainly that. At 300 pages to cover some major topics in the French Revolution, you kind of have to be. Very different from a lot of other biographies I've read where they're like, 700-800 pages up to 1,000 pages that are just like so much detail, and it's really dense and kind of everything that it gives you. That's not what this is at all, and that's why I was kind of drawn to it. I think there's ups and downs with it. It definitely gets you like right into the heart of the action very quickly. There's a chapter, maybe a chapter and a half, that covers his childhood and his upbringing, but he's basically in Paris in his legal profession by page like 25. So it really wastes no time, which I think is good or bad depending on what you're interested in. I thought it worked well for this book specifically, and for the author's style. It kind of puts you right into the heat of the action. So that's just something that I think people may like or not like depending on what exactly they're trying to get out of it. What I liked about it too is that I've just kind of come fresh off reading and listening to a lot of other like overarching histories of the entire French Revolution, trying to pull in all the major arcs and events and all the different people that were involved. This was kind of fresh because everything happens like obviously through Danton's perspective or the people that he immediately interacted with. And I do think the author did a good job of pulling in other kind of topics when he needed to, just to kind of get like the bigger narrative. But this was able to focus just on more specific time periods, which I think is pretty interesting. Because obviously, like when he's executed in the spring of 1794, like obviously events of the French Revolution, like the Thermidorian reaction and stuff that comes after the fall of Robespierre, and then everything that happens after that, between that period and then leading up to the rise of Napoleon. Obviously, none of that stuff is really covered. He does give like maybe like 4 or 5 pages at the very, very end to kind of give like a very high level, like this is what happened after Danton's execution, and some of the major figures kind of around him and his sphere that are still around at the time of his death. He does give like a very high level overview of what like ended up happening with them in future years in their lives, which I thought was cool to get some specifics on those figures. So all in all, I really liked it. I think I would say this is like a good biography. I would give it like a 3.5 out of 5. I think it's a little tough when I think there's certain sections that are like such major events or so like important to the overall narrative that you wish you could get a little bit more detail. But again, like if it's a short biography, like you're going to get a more succinct telling of it. That's just how it's going to work. I think that, his story and his life is just so crazy, but he really, really comes into the fore. I think like the first like major thing he does is helps orchestrate the August the 10th insurrection, which leads to the downfall, literally the downfall of Louis as the reigning monarch, even if at that point under the constitutional monarchy, and he was effectively a prisoner in Paris at that point. So his powers were significantly reduced, but the August 10th insurrection, sometimes called the Second French Revolution, literally removed him from power completely. And he was literally a prisoner after that point and would eventually face trial and execution. Danton was like very, very key in orchestrating a big part of that insurrection. And then so from this moment onward, when he becomes like the Minister of Justice for a time, before he finally gets elected to the National Convention, which he had not been elected to the national bodies or assemblies until the convention, which I thought was interesting. And then the rise of the Revolutionary Tribunal, the Committee of Public Safety, which Danton was right at the center of, literally. Though all that stuff I think is covered extremely well, and again, it should, because that he was such a central figure to all of those things. And then his eventual undoing, I thought, was interesting. A lot of it, like his involvement in the war in Belgium or the Austrian Netherlands with General de Maurier and his downfall, I think played a big role in this. So I think that was covered well. Potential misuse of funds, which I don't think there really was. I think it was more so just like lack of proper accounting and finance stuff, which was probably like with so much going on, you can't be surprised. When he was Minister of Justice, as they were trying to ramp up this spend to try to curb some of what was going on. And he of course was still involved in all this war discussion with the levée en masse and really trying to recruit people for the army during the Revolutionary Wars. And I think that was a big accomplishment of his, even if you could, again, like this charge against him with some of this improper spending. That was, I think, an interesting discussion, because I think there's evidence both ways for that. So that was interesting for sure to read about. And then again, his ultimate downfall when the Committee of Public Safety kind of shifts into fully in Robespierre and Saint-Just power. It was basically a fight to the end from that point, and his like downfall from there at the hands of the very thing that he was so central in creating, the Revolutionary Tribunal, is quite fascinating. So I think that arc was played really good. I think Danton also is an interesting figure because he is one of those incendiary, he's definitely not as incendiary as somebody like Jean-Paul Marat, who is featured heavily in this because they shared time together at the Cordelier Club that Danton was the president of for some time. Not as incendiary or revolutionary at the start. I think he thought there was a place for constitutional monarchy. It was more so just as events in the war progressed, he became more radicalized. Like I said, he had a big role in that August the 10th insurrection, and I think he had been a little on the fence about political violence at the hand of Paris mobs, the sans-culottes, or whoever, using it kind of like to his means for a time, which I think is a big critique you can give of him. Some of his remarks may have sparked or certainly given some oxygen to the September massacres, which I think is a big hit against him in terms of this open kind of like somewhat consent to political violence. So that's something that I think, and the author does a good job of mentioning this. And I think that's something that could even be like a further critique of him and his career, because obviously the revolution just spirals into such violence and chaos, and it just totally gets out of control. What I do like, though, is that when specifically he was politically rivaled against the Girondins, specifically Brissot and Madame Roland, for like this entire period basically of the convention until the Girondins are purged from the convention, and then a lot of them are executed at the hands of the Committee of Public Safety. I like that Danton at this point was completely outraged by it. Even though these were his political opponents, he realized that just massacring people just because they have political differences from you was just like, that was the line. And I think he realized that what he had created ultimately came to be just totally blown out of proportion, and was just like absolutely egregiously abusing that power in really, really bad ways. So he understood this, and he fought against it. I mean, literally to the death. So that is something that I think is a cool arc, even if he was too much or too accepting of this kind of trend of political violence for a time. He ultimately, towards the end of his career, came to be against it and did fight against the overuse of the Revolutionary Tribunal for those purposes. But by that point, it was just out of his hands. So there's an interesting arc there, and very interesting. Loved reading about it, and especially reading about things from his perspective. I think that he, like I didn't know that his wife died in childbirth with, I can't remember, maybe their third or their fourth kid, kind of in the heat of all this action, and he was actually away on mission while that happened. So I think that builds some empathy. And then he does remarry after that, which again, you get empathy for the whole family when he ends up getting executed in his mid-30s, and he leaves behind a young widow and multiple children. So there's just a lot to contend with there, and you can kind of like extrapolate that to other figures where this is happening to them, kind of in this chaos of this period of the French Revolution. So learning about some of that backstory was cool, and kind of like his home life just apart from all of his political achievements and political doings. I think the other thing I thought was interesting that I learned and did not know, he's obviously associated with the Cordelier Club because he was basically a founding member because he lived right around that area. I did not realize that he literally was elected as president of the Cordelier district before the Paris districts were basically rearranged into sections. And then so the specific Cordelier district got eaten up by a bigger territory, and he did not win that seat anymore. That's when it transitioned from a literal, like the smallest local level of politics to just an active political club. And then he became involved with the Jacobin Club as well. But that I thought was cool because I don't think I understood it from that perspective, where he literally was voted president multiple times of an actual political body at the smallest level. So pretty cool start. And he was involved in that from the very beginning. And then that does become the Cordelier Club, of which he has such prominence. I think his involvement with figures like Camille Desmoulins, that he was friends with from the beginning and a member of the Cordelier Club with him, and then Robespierre, who he rubbed shoulders with in the Jacobin Club, who ultimately would be his executioner, essentially. Getting their kind of like their early interactions all the way through his downfall, knowing that he was going to be the person that basically took power from him, I thought was extremely interesting. And then lastly, that when I'm trying to remember the exact timing, but he actually could have been elected to the Paris Commune after the kind of the sections of Paris were reestablished and everything. But then he got elected from his district, but the other sections basically vetoed his being able to take office, because I think it was some rule that the Constituent Assembly at that point had put in that person would have to be verified by the other Paris sections, and he was not, because he was seen as a more incendiary member, especially opposed to the way more moderate like Fouillade party that would be kind of more in power at the time. So that I thought was cool. And then he had like various other roles where he eventually would work like for the Commune as a deputy prosecutor, and then once all of France was distributed into departments, which I think it still is today, he did get elected to the actual Paris department. So he did have like some kind of a role to play, like when, say like in the flight to Varennes, or before that when the royal family was trying to leave Paris to go to Saint-Cloud for, I think it was an Easter service by a non-juring priest. All that stuff is mentioned, and he does have involvement there. I think the lines of like who had what jurisdiction politically is like fascinating, but also really hard to kind of figure out the details of all that during this time period. So he is, he's involved in a lot of those things, which I think is cool. And I hadn't really read or heard much about like what the actual like Paris department did versus the Commune or the other national bodies or assemblies at the time. So that was kind of a cool, interesting thing, because I didn't know that he specifically had that post. And then after the August the 10th insurrection, again, he becomes Minister of Justice, gets elected to the convention, and that's kind of, he's off from that point, member of the Committee of Public Safety, and he's off from that point until the end of his career. So it's an interesting arc, and I think he has such an interesting role to play in the French Revolution. So there's a lot in here that's worth reading about if you're interested in him as a figure, or just the French Revolution at large, because like this is a kind of, it's a more specific and honed in view of certain events through his perspective and his life and what he accomplishes. But I still think it's quite interesting nonetheless, if you're interested in the topic. So again, I would say this is a good biography. I would give it 3.5 out of 5. And yeah, I have a lot of other bios on major figures of the French Revolution that I'm going to get to fairly soon, and I'm excited about that. But yeah, this is my early thoughts for Danton. Very much enjoyed reading it.